All right. Welcome back to the class with a name so long that Forrest Gump got tired trying to run to the end of it. For anyone who's listening to the recording in the future, it's actually really windy today, and so you might hear that in the background, but we're going to power through. Today, we are going to talk about what the battlefield looks like. All right, last week we started really broad, really far back, kind of looking at the grand scope of things, really philosophical and theological. How do we approach life with really broad strokes? And I'm picturing kind of like Google Earth. We're just slowly scrolling in. Eventually the goal is to get to the individual. And so before we get to the individual, like, you don't exist in a vacuum. And so we're going to talk about what world we find ourselves in. What's our culture look like? What can we learn about pornography looking at it scientifically? Just what do we find ourselves in? I want to say really quick that subtitle there is said a little bit in jest. We'll talk about that later. And before we get in proper, I'm going to give you guys a new vocab word. And it's unwanted sexual behavior. That's a nice clinical term for you. And I like it because it includes pornography. Pornography is an unwanted sexual behavior, but it's not exclusive. And so this is a clinical term which includes pornography, but can also include having affairs or hiring prostitutes or what have you. It's unwanted sexual behavior. Nice, clean, clinical term for you there. All right. So we're going to start out tonight talking about what can science tell us about pornography? And spoiler, not a lot. But we have to talk about the problem why it can't tell us a lot first. There's not a very big body of scientific literature on pornography. There is in terms of studies of percentages and stuff like that, but we don't have a very comprehensive body in terms of like, it's unhealthy for you because this. We don't have a clinical list for it. At least not in a very valid's not the right word, in a very comprehensive sense. Most institutions that fight pornography in the modern world do so on religious grounds or moral grounds or even just societal grounds. But if we're going to talk about fighting pornography on a scientific ground, there's really only one big one. And that is this website called Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug, if you just look at their stuff really briefly, it looks like pretty well done science. I looked at it for a long time, and I still think that, as far as I can tell, it looks like pretty well done science. But we have a couple big problems. The first is, like I said earlier, there's not a lot of corroboration, right? A big part of science is validating results. It's not just enough for me to say like, hey, I did an experiment and I got these answers, right? Then the next step in science is you, in a different city, do that same experiment and you see if you get the same answers, and then someone else on the other side of the world does the same experiment, right? Good science has to be repeatable, right? You have to be able to do the experiment again and get the same results. That's how you solidify answers in science. But we have a problem is there's not a whole lot of other institutions out there doing these kinds of experiments. And so on the one hand, their answers may be right or their answers may be wrong, but there's no validation. That's a minor problem. A slightly bigger problem is that even if the science is good, society unfortunately has a really good, well, maybe not a good, they have a excuse to dismiss this if they don't like the answers. Because Fight the New Drug has very close ties with the Mormon Church. Now, precisely what those close ties are, I couldn't nail down anywhere. I saw lots and lots and lots of rumors, ranging from lots of their income comes from the Mormon Church to their initial startup capital came from the Mormon Church. I couldn't find anything that was verifiable. At the very least, several, if not all of the people in charge at Fight the New Drug are higher ups in the Mormon Church. It's based out of Utah. It just overall is not a good look if you are trying to present yourself as a scientific institution presenting real research. If the general population can just dismiss you with like, oh, those people aren't objective. You want your scientists to be objective. So that's a little bit of a problem. But there's a problem not just with this company. I use them as an example because there's a much deeper problem with studying pornography. And actually, I think that problem, we have a good example, comes right there from their name. All right, Fight the New Drug is an excellent name in terms of marketing. It's immediately evocative, right? But pornography is not a drug. All right? We are actually, as a scientific community, pretty stinking good at understanding drugs. All right, take your pick. We can study caffeine or alcohol or cocaine or whatever you want. We can study drugs incredibly well. And the way we study drugs incredibly well are through these things. If you want to study a drug, you get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and preferably thousands of mice, right? The term we use is lab rats, but that's not accurate. We actually, by vast majority, use mice. And the reason you use mice, well, there's a couple reasons. One is they're mammals, and so relatively speaking, their biology is closer to ours than, say, worms, which is our second biggest thing that we run experiments on. But the big thing is their reproductive rate. If you want to run tests on animals, you need thousands of animals, and so you need a whole bunch of generations really fast. And so mice are good at that. And here's how you would study one of those drugs if you wanted to study, let's say, alcohol. You would take, 2,000 mice, and you would say, like, hey, these mice, they get 10 milliliters of alcohol at 10 o'clock. And then you take another 2,000 mice, and you say, this group gets 1.5 milliliters of alcohol at 10 o'clock every morning. And you do that with each group, right? And you tweak the dials very precisely. And then after you run that experiment for, 3 months, 6 months, you can take all those mice and dissect them. And you can learn everything you want about them. You can look at their heart disease. You can look at their, do they have lung cancer? What's their liver like? What's their brain chemistry like? Like, you can just get all these numbers out of these mice. And then you can run that experiment again. But this time, your control group gets 10 milliliters at 10 o'clock, and your other group is now getting 1 milliliter, but spread out 10 times throughout the day. All right, it's the same dosage, but more spread out. How does that vary? And so we can learn how drugs affect biological systems really precisely through these precision dialing of these scientific dials. That was a terrible way to structure that sentence. And this is how we can get to points where we say, like, hey, if you have 2 glasses of wine at night as opposed to 1 glass of wine, that's going to increase your risk of heart disease by 17.2%. I don't know. I'm making these numbers up off the top of my head. But that's how you get that precise, is millions and hundreds of millions, quite honestly, of these mice have given their lives for science. And we appreciate that. And you might have already seen the problem. Porn isn't a chemical. All right? It's not something that you can just inject into mice. We don't know how to make mouse porn. All right. We don't know how to make a video that the mice would react to like humans react to human porn. And even if we could, we would have no way of properly equating like, yes, this version of mouse porn is the equivalent of human porn. We just can't do that experiment. All right. How you would actually do that experiment would be to get 2,000 or preferably like 5,000 people, and you would run the experiment on people. And so you would say like, all right, these 2,000 people, you don't get to watch porn ever, zero, nada. You're the control group. And then you take another 2,000 people and you're like, all right, you guys watch porn once a week. And it has to be for 30 minutes, and you can't watch more than that. You can't watch less than that. And then you take another group, and that's how you would do that experiment if you wanted to actually get results. A big problem, no ethics board would ever sign off on that experiment, because if the question you're asking is this thing harmful, then no ethics board is going to sign off on, well, let's apply it to people and see if it hurts them. All right? Not to be a little dramatic, but that was how Nazis did science. It's like, is this thing harmful? I don't know. Give it to a prisoner and we'll find out. It's like, if the question is the thing harmful, then you don't get to apply it to people. You have to start somewhere else. That's one big problem. The other big problem with running this experiment, and this is running into the problems we run with other experiments, specifically with eating food, diets. There's the word I'm looking for. With studying diets is people don't actually do it. Right? If you tell a group of people like, hey, there's 2,000 of you, and none of you get to watch any porn, zero, for the next 5 years, your control group is going to drop from 2,000 people to about 50 people, because most of the people aren't actually going to do this. This is a problem we have all the time with studying diets, is scientists will assign diets and people will go and not follow them. And that invalidates them as test subjects, right? People don't like sticking to diets for 2 years or 5 years or whatnot. So that's there's a whole lot of problems there about studying pornography. And those are roadblocks for us having a good body of scientific literature on pornography. And I'll be completely honest, I could not find any, again, confirmed cases of this. But I want to bring it up anyways, just so we have a complete picture. It is possible that since pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry with a vested interest with its continued consumption, that there might be some bribery going on to maybe not study this particular subject. Again, I could not find any confirmed cases of this. I want to be absolutely transparent about that. But I also want to point out that we have no problem accusing our politicians and corporations of the exact same thing of, there's under-the-table deals going on and people are buying people off because they have vested interest. And it's like, are we really going to turn and say these companies that make porn, they are the moral high ground here? They're not going to stoop to bribery, right? So that's what we're looking at scientifically. We unfortunately don't have a body of literature to go on like we do with alcohol or cocaine or caffeine, or take your pick. So that's the battlefield scientifically. How about culturally? Well, culturally, pornography is a global problem. It's not just limited to the US or the West or even first world countries. It is quite literally a global problem. Now these are all kind of anecdotal evidence here. We're going to read a couple different passages, 3 of them from Pure Desire and 1 from Unwanted. I'm going to jump around a little bit, so I hope you'll bear with me. Before we start Pure Desire, I do want to give just a really brief overview of the author, just to give a little bit of context. He was a fighter pilot during the Vietnam War, came back home afterwards, really struggled with pornography, got his life together, and he's now a pastor in Oregon. And he has been invited to preach in several places around the world. And so I want to start in chapter 1 of Pure Desire. All right, he says, ironically, I'm not starting at the beginning of the chapter. Ironically, 20 years later, I found myself back in the Far East. This time, I was speaking about God's grace. Yet, I didn't have long to think about God's abundant grace in my past, because I needed his grace right then. I had no idea what kind of questions would be coming my way in the next 30 to 40 minutes. These were Chinese businessmen, some of whom ran huge corporations. I wasn't familiar with their culture and had no clue where they would be coming from. How could I respond to these men who were so different from the average American guys I had listened to for years? This was totally new terrain for me. The questions came slowly at first, almost as if they were checking me out. And in a sense, they were. Men don't easily talk about their sexuality, especially their struggles. After about 15 minutes, I was astounded. They asked the same questions I had answered for years in the States. They were fighting the same battles I had helped so many men deal with at home. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. The year before I went to Hong Kong, church leaders and pastors in Argentina asked me to speak to them about the Holy Spirit's ministry in dealing with sexual addiction. I tried with everything I had to get them to change the subject. I had been to Argentina, and I knew they had great families. Sure, sexual addiction would be an issue, but it wouldn't be nearly as severe as it was in the States, where families were experiencing disintegration. To make a long story short, they wouldn't change the subject, and I am so glad they didn't. I ended up spending more than 2 hours talking and praying personally with the leaders, at times holding them in my arms as they wept and confessed incredible stories of addiction, bondage, and incidents where hell was tearing apart huge ministries. I'm going to jump ahead again a little bit here. I was speaking in the Bible Belt not too long ago. When I asked the gracious pastor what he wanted me to share about during the weekend service, he said, "Just tell them about the great work God is doing in your church." I said, "I would love to do that, but I will end up talking about real life, about the bondage, addiction, and trauma that so many people are struggling with today. And I will challenge them to open up these areas of their lives so God open up the areas of these areas of their lives to God so he can heal them and set them free." The expression on his face changed a bit, and he commented, "Well, I don't think we have a lot of folks dealing with the depth of issues that you're talking about. This isn't just the Bible Belt part of the country. We call it the buckle of the Bible Belt." But that pastor gave me the green light, so I didn't pull any punches. Then, at the end of the service, I gave an altar call for people struggling with sexual issues. No one moved at first. Then the dam broke, and they lined up 3 to 4 deep at the altar. It was obvious from the looks on their faces that they were reaching out to me, but I had to leave immediately or I would have missed my plane. On the way to the airport, I was stunned when the pastor asked me, "Well, that was quite a service, but now what are we going to do with these people?" He had perceived what had occurred as a negative. In a sense, I can understand how he felt, because so many pastors I have met have no idea what to do with this issue other than preach against it. But what he was seeing was not a negative. It was, in fact, the true condition of his flock. I'm going to jump over to Unwanted by Jay Stringer here. Now we're going to talk about South Korea. He says, "Several years ago, I flew to Seoul, South Korea, to visit my brother. We were in a bar one night and ended up sitting next to a table of men from the United States and the UK. We ended up conversing, and they asked me what type of work I was involved in back in Seattle. I told them about my therapy practice, and unsolicited, they each went on to tell me about the sex they had purchased in South Korea and Southeast Asia. I was astounded by what I heard. Each man spoke to seeing a deadness in the eyes of the women and teenagers that they had purchased sex from. One particularly honest man told me he went to a small village in Thailand where he was treated like a king. He was given access to any woman or child he desired. He put it like this: I remember thinking, who have I become? It started with a fantasy of having sex in Thailand, and by the end of my trip, I was doing horrible things I swore I would never do in my life. By the time I left South Korea, I had heard story after story of men who had given in to their hijacked desires. The more they did, the more they experienced internal and external alienation. They described feeling as if their consciences had been marred by their behavior, with a few even experiencing waves of nausea in recalling their actions with the women and girls they had commercially exploited. My time in South Korea cornered me with the reality that our battle is not solely against the flesh and blood of personal sexual brokenness, but against the powers and principalities of this world that delight in seeing God's gift of sex debased. I'm going to hop back to pure desire because I like being difficult. No, because I actually think that this is where I want to finish reading at. Back to pure desire. He says, as I talked to those men in Hong Kong, I finally realized that over the last 10 years, in every country and in every region of the United States where I had spoken about the issue of sexual bondage, hell was tearing the church apart. All right, this is not unique to us. This is a global problem. So, this is a class on tools, and we discussed last week. We want to understand how the enemy works. So, what are the tools that the enemy is using to make it a global problem? Well, the first is a fairly common idea. I have it credited to Unwanted there. That's just where it is in my books, but I heard this idea years ago, which is the 3 A's. Porn appeals to the 3 A's. The first is anonymity. All right. Back in the day, if you wanted pornography, you had to actually go to the CD gas station and buy it. And that means that you might be seen. You might be seen going into the CD gas station. You might be seen coming out with the blacked out magazine. Like, you might be spotted. All right, your reputation might take a hit. People whose opinions you care about might see you. With the internet, you don't have that problem. You have it delivered to you in your home and no one knows about it. That's not true. Your internet provider knows exactly what you're doing. They just don't really care because everybody in your neighborhood is doing the exact same thing. But it feels anonymous. The second A is affordability. Again, back in the day, you had to go out and actually pay for, with real money, the pornographic magazines. And now it's coming to you free. Not entirely free. You have to pay for your internet connection, but you're going to do that anyways because you like having email and Facebook and YouTube. And anyone who's listening to this is listening to this because of the internet. The third A is availability. Again, back in the day, you had to go to the gas station. You actually had to get up off your couch and walk or drive somewhere. That takes time out of your day and effort. Now, you don't have to get off your couch. You pull this little magic rectangle out of your pocket, hit a couple buttons, and there it is. Another way I heard these 3 A's described as each of them is removing a potential cost, right? Anonymity is removing the social cost. Your reputation is not going to drop. Affordability is reducing the literal monetary cost, and availability it would be reducing the effort cost. You don't have to do any work to obtain this thing. Those are 3 tools that hell is using to make pornography a global problem. I want to say right here before we move on, just to be absolutely clear, the sex industry is not at fault for your unwanted sexual behavior, right? It is the battlefield that we find ourselves in, but ultimately, at least as far as this class goes, we are always going to bring it back to your responsibility, to your free will, and to your relationship with God. Unwanted uses the analogy of squatters, right? You have a house that you're supposed to take care of. You're responsible for it. And if you don't if you're not involved in its upkeep, there's plenty of squatters who are more than willing to come in and squat in it. Well, what other tools does hell use? Well, we had a really good conversation last week after the video on jargon. And so let's talk a little bit about the real common jargon, at least that I found in Unwanted. I split up into two categories, though I'm sure there's more out there. All right, there is jargon, and we kind of defined jargon last week as language that carries baggage, words that mean much more to your brain than just what they mean literally if you look them up in a dictionary. So the first category there is jargon that is used to dehumanize the people that are being exploited, quite honestly. The first one there is happy hunting. I did include the other example they used, which was don't overfish this spot. And these are phrases that men who are, let's say, searching for prostitutes might use. You have language that reduces the individuals to that of objects or to that of food, only fit for consumption. All right, not awesome stuff. But I want to read the next part to you here regarding the jargon that we use to rationalize the behavior. All right, reading from Unwanted, Chapter 10 again. When clients or friends open up about pornography that they are involved with, what they usually quickly say is something along the lines of, I don't get into any of that hardcore stuff. I'm more into ... You fill in the blank. It could be just pictures, not videos. Or just consensual couples having sex, not multiple men. Only webcams of women stripping, not giving oral sex. Just women I know are over 18, not younger ones. The list goes on. We contrive these justifications to distance ourselves from the reality that we are using human beings to fill our emptiness and making them surrogate objects for our hostility. I actually want to talk about these a little bit here because as I was typing them out, it begged the question for me. I love that phrase. So the first one there, pictures, not videos. Like I don't watch videos. I just look at the pictures. And the question that springs to my mind is immediately, because that's what the sin is, right? Right? It's you can look at the pictures. That's not sinful. It's when the pictures are moving. That's what makes it sin. That makes sense. Yes? No? No? No, that doesn't make sense. Same thing for just couples, not groups. It's like, again, that's not where the sin actually is. But this last one here is, I think, where it really clicked with me. Referring to, I only watch when I know that the women are over 18. Because here's where the jargon comes into play. Here's where the implication is. Here's what that's saying. Because that's justifying by saying, it might be bad, but it could be worse. Like, maybe this isn't the best thing, but at least I'm better than those people over there watching child pornography. And on the one hand, it's like, yes, that is very bad. But you can do this with any sin. It's like if I asked you if stealing a car is wrong, you would say yes. But the guy stealing the car is like, well, I stole a car, but it's not like I killed a guy. And then you go and find the guy who killed somebody. It's like, yeah, but that was in self-defense. I wouldn't kill anybody on purpose. And then you find the guy who killed somebody on purpose. And he's like, well, but they were a real jerk. I wouldn't kill anybody innocent. And you kind of forget that if we go all the way back, it's like, no, stealing a car is still wrong. Right? All these justifications are doing is, at least I'm not as bad as those people over there. Right? And that's helpful to soothe your conscience, but it's not true. It's not healthy to your relationship with God. It's not healthy to you in the long run. Again, I just want to emphasize, this class is not about condemnation, okay, but understanding how the enemy works. These are the kinds of things they say. This is how they manipulate human beings. this is all kind of a downer, and I like leaving us on an upbeat note. So we're going to jump to Unwanted Chapter 12 to talk about pursuing a new sexual story. In the 80s, the famous Just Say No campaign was intended to discourage children and adolescents from using drugs. The initiative was not effective, and ironically may have increased alcohol and cigarette use among drug users. The synopsis of the failure was that saying no is not an effective solution to destructive behavior. One must pursue something generative. Many recovery programs fail because they are preoccupied with telling people what behavior to avoid. True recovery is not about quarantine of the body, but about its restoration. A new sexual story is about inviting your body, heart, and soul into the fullness of nurture, sensuality, and eroticism. And there's a lot of words in there that we are going to dive into much deeper in later weeks. But that's going to give you a hint of where we are going with this class. It's not enough to just stop the bad behavior. You actually have to replace it with something good. Because, psychologically speaking, the bad behavior has a purpose. It has a function. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's feeding some sort of need. And so if you just try to stop the behavior, okay, that's good. We do want to stop the bad behavior, but you're more complicated than that. What is that behavior? What need is that behavior trying to address? And then how do we address it? In a healthy way, in a good way.